Ma'am, can I see your ID and boarding pass?
Is there a problem, officer?
Just a routine check. Please provide identification.
Am I being detained, or am I free to go?
The fluorescent lights of Terminal B hummed with a low, relentless frequency, casting long, sterile shadows across the polished linoleum floor. It was 11 at night, that strange, liminal hour at the airport where the manic energy of the daytime rush has bled out, leaving behind only exhausted travelers and the hollow echoes of rolling suitcases. Evelyn just wanted to go home. She was 52, her shoulders aching from a 3-day legal conference in Chicago, and the strap of her heavy leather briefcase was digging a familiar trench into her collarbone. She wore a simple beige trench coat over a dark turtleneck, her hair pulled back into a neat, no-nonsense knot. To anyone passing by, she was just another tired woman waiting for a delayed connection. But to Officer Thomas Miller, standing near the security checkpoint with a stale coffee in his hand, she was a blip on the radar. Miller was 10 years into the job, a veteran of airport security who prided himself on his gut instincts. The problem with gut instincts, however, is that they are often just unexamined biases disguised as experience. Miller watched Evelyn shift her weight, adjust her grip on the unusually bulky briefcase, and glance toward the exit doors. In his mind, the narrative was already writing itself. He saw a black woman lingering near the exits, avoiding eye contact, holding tight to a bag that looked too heavy for a simple overnight trip. He didn't see exhaustion, he saw evasion. Miller tossed his coffee into a nearby bin and adjusted his utility belt, the leather creaking slightly as he stepped out from the alcove. He didn't have reasonable suspicion. In law enforcement, reasonable, articulable suspicion is the foundational requirement for a Terry stop, a brief detention to investigate whether a crime is occurring. It requires specific, objective facts. Looking nervous or standing near an exit does not meet the threshold. But Miller had stopped caring about the strict definitions of the law years ago, relying instead on a dangerous assumption that his badge gave him the right to ask questions until he found a reason to act. He approached her from behind, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the practiced, flat authority of a man used to unquestioned compliance. Evelyn turned, blinking away her fatigue. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone polite but reserved. "Can I see your ID and boarding pass?" Miller asked, holding out a hand. He didn't ask how her night was or if she needed directions. He went straight for a demand, cloaked as a request. Evelyn didn't reach into her purse. Instead, she looked at his outstretched hand, then up to his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. "Just doing routine checks," Miller lied easily. "Need to see some identification." Evelyn knew the law. In fact, she knew the law better than almost anyone in that building. She knew that in this jurisdiction, unless an officer suspects you of committing a crime, you are under no obligation to provide identification simply because they ask. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice steady, dropping the exact legal phrase that forces an officer to define the nature of the encounter. Miller's jaw tightened. He hated when civilians used that phrase. To him, knowing your rights wasn't a sign of civic awareness. It was a red flag for defiance. "I'm just asking for your ID, ma'am. If you don't have anything to hide, it shouldn't be an issue." It was the classic fallback, the verbal trap designed to make the assertion of a constitutional right look like an admission of guilt. "Officer," Evelyn said, maintaining eye contact without a hint of aggression, "I am waiting for my husband to pull the car around. Unless you have reasonable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime, I am not required to provide my identification. So I will ask again. Am I free to go, or am I being detained?" The tension in the air thickened, sharp and electric. Miller stepped closer, invading her personal space, a classic intimidation tactic. He looked at the bulky leather briefcase. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, completely ignoring her question. "Personal belongings," she replied simply. "I'm going to need to look inside," Miller said, reaching out toward the handle of the briefcase. This was the moment the encounter crossed the line from a tense consensual conversation into a blatant constitutional violation. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. To search that bag without her consent, Miller needed probable cause, a reasonable belief, based on factual evidence, that a crime had been committed, and that evidence of that crime was in the bag. He had nothing. He had a hunch built on prejudice and bruised ego. As his hand grazed the leather, Evelyn instinctively pulled the bag back, stepping away. "I do not consent to a search of my property," she stated clearly, her voice raising just enough to be heard over the hum of the terminal, but still entirely devoid of panic. Miller's mind short-circuited. In his worldview, a black woman refusing a search in an airport was all the probable cause he needed. He perceived her assertion of her rights as active resistance. "Stop resisting," he barked, a phrase used so often in modern policing as a preemptive justification for force that it has almost lost its meaning. But Evelyn wasn't resisting. She was retreating from an unlawful search. Miller lunged forward, grabbing her left arm. He didn't just hold it. He wrenched it backward with a sudden, violent torque, utilizing a pain compliance technique on a woman who had offered no physical threat. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp of pain as the heavy briefcase slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud, its brass clasps popping open to reveal nothing but thick stacks of legal briefs and manila folders. But Miller wasn't looking at the bag anymore. His adrenaline was spiked, his training entirely overridden by a desperate need to establish dominance. He spun her around, shoving her forcefully against the cold stainless steel of a nearby ticketing kiosk. The impact knocked the wind out of her, her cheek pressing against the metal as Miller's knee drove into the back of her leg to keep her off balance. "I told you to comply," he shouted, unholstering his handcuffs. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed sickeningly in the quiet terminal as he forced her wrists together, the cold steel biting into her skin. "You are under arrest for interfering with an officer and resisting." A few straggling passengers stopped in their tracks, their faces pale, watching in stunned silence. Nobody intervened. They just watched the police officer manhandle a well-dressed woman, assuming, as society so often trains us to do, that she must have done something to deserve it. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She knew exactly how dangerous this situation was, and she knew that the only place to fight a bad arrest was in a courtroom, not on an airport concourse. "You are making a profound procedural error," she managed to say through gritted teeth, her shoulders screaming in agony. Miller just scoffed, marching her aggressively toward the airport security holding office. The holding room was a stark, windowless box that smelled of stale sweat and cheap floor cleaner. Miller shoved her into a hard plastic chair, leaving her cuffed behind her back. "We'll see how smart you are when we run your prints," he muttered, turning to his computer terminal. A few moments later, the heavy door swung open and Sergeant Davis walked in. Davis was older, graying at the temples, a man who actually read the legal updates the department sent out. He looked at Evelyn, sitting quietly in the chair, her trench coat rumpled, a faint red bruise forming on her cheek. Then he looked at Miller. "What do we have here, Tom?" Davis asked, his tone neutral but probing. "Refused to identify, acting suspicious near the exits. Got combative when I asked to check her bag. Resisting arrest," Miller rattled off, the lies coming smoothly, framed in the sterile language of police reports. Davis frowned. He turned to Evelyn. "Ma'am, do you have identification on you?" Evelyn looked up, her expression unreadable. "In my inside coat pocket. I couldn't reach it earlier as your officer was busy violating my Fourth Amendment rights without articulable suspicion." Davis's eyes narrowed slightly at the precise legal phrasing. He walked over, gently reaching into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He flipped it open. The silence that followed was heavy, profound, and absolute. Davis didn't just see a driver's license. He saw a gold-embossed badge and a federal judicial identification card. He looked at the card, then at the woman in the chair, and the blood drained completely from his face. "You've got to be kidding me," Davis whispered. Miller, entirely oblivious to the impending disaster, puffed out his chest. "What? She got warrants?" Davis slowly turned around, holding the ID out for Miller to see. "Tom," Davis said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly quiet register. "This is the Honorable Evelyn Carter. She is a United States District Judge." The silence returned, but this time it was deafening. Miller stared at the ID, his brain struggling to process the information. A judge. He had just tackled, handcuffed, and falsely arrested a federal judge. The smug certainty that had fueled him moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. "Uncuff her," Davis ordered sharply. "Right now." Miller fumbled with his keys, his hands suddenly shaking, the metallic clicks sounding entirely different now that the power dynamic had violently shifted. As the cuffs fell away, Evelyn brought her arms forward, slowly rubbing her raw wrists. She didn't yell, she didn't gloat. The terrifying reality of the situation wasn't that she was a judge who got assaulted. The terrifying reality was what would have happened to her if she hadn't been. "Judge Carter, I am so deeply sorry," Davis began, stepping back respectfully. "There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding." Evelyn stood up, smoothing down her coat with dignified precision. She looked at Miller, who was now staring at the floor, suddenly looking very small in his uniform. "There was no misunderstanding, Sergeant," Evelyn said, her voice echoing with the authority of the bench. "Your officer made an assumption based on my appearance. He initiated an investigative stop without reasonable suspicion. He demanded a search without probable cause or a warrant. And when I verbally asserted my constitutional rights, he used excessive physical force to punish me for my non-compliance. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a textbook deprivation of rights under color of law." She didn't wait for an apology. She picked up her heavy briefcase, the brass clasps clicking shut, and walked out of the room, leaving the two officers drowning in the wake of their own catastrophic failure. But the story doesn't end with a dramatic exit, because the real world rarely moves with the swift, satisfying justice of a movie. In the real world, the wheels of accountability grind with excruciating slowness. The following morning, the airport authority's Internal Affairs Division pulled the security footage from Terminal B. The video was high definition, shot from 2 different angles. It was silent, but the lack of audio only made the visual evidence more damning. The footage showed a tired woman standing perfectly still. It showed an officer approaching her aggressively. It showed him reaching for her property unprovoked, and it showed him violently throwing her against a metal kiosk when she simply stepped back. There was no lunging, no raised fists, no threatening posture from Evelyn. The objective reality of the camera stripped away the subjective narrative Miller had written in his head. The video proved that his gut instinct was entirely divorced from fact. Despite the irrefutable evidence, Miller wasn't fired the next day. The procedural reality of police unions and bureaucratic red tape kicked in. He was placed on paid administrative leave pending a full investigation. He went home, sat on his couch, and collected a paycheck while the city scrambled to perform damage control. Evelyn, meanwhile, returned to her chambers. She had to undergo physical therapy for a torn rotator cuff caused by the violent twist of her arm. She didn't seek a quiet settlement. Instead, she filed a meticulous, unassailable civil rights lawsuit, carefully detailing the Fourth Amendment violations. The local news eventually picked up the story, and the airport security footage was leaked to the public. The outrage was immediate, but Evelyn refused to let the narrative become a simple shouting match. She used her platform to focus on the procedural mechanics of the failure. She pointed out that if an officer could so brazenly bypass the constitutional rights of a federal judge, the average citizen, someone without legal training, without resources, without a title, stood absolutely no chance. Months dragged on. Depositions were taken. Miller, sitting across a conference table from Evelyn's attorneys, was forced to explain, frame by frame, exactly what his probable cause was. Under the harsh light of legal scrutiny, his justifications crumbled into dust. He couldn't articulate a single fact that warranted the stop, let alone the physical assault. Eventually, the pressure became insurmountable. The city settled the lawsuit for a significant sum, which Evelyn promptly donated to a legal aid fund focused on Fourth Amendment defense. Facing inevitable termination and potential federal civil rights charges, Thomas Miller was quietly allowed to resign. He lost his badge, his pension, and his career, not because he made a simple mistake, but because he allowed his implicit bias to completely override the constitutional boundaries he was sworn to protect. He learned the hard way that a badge is a responsibility to uphold the law, not a shield to act outside of it. This story forces us to look past the dramatic headlines and examine the quiet, insidious nature of procedural failure. When an officer skips the fundamental steps of reasonable suspicion and probable cause, they aren't just breaking a rule, they are dismantling the very foundation of civil liberties. It asks us to consider a chilling reality. If a woman who knows the exact contours of the law can be violently detained for merely invoking her rights, how safe are the rights of those who don't even know the words to defend themselves? Ultimately, the lesson here is not just about the dangers of unchecked authority, but about the fragile nature of our constitutional protections. The Fourth Amendment is only as strong as the willingness of the institutions to enforce it and the courage of the individual to demand it. The law is not a weapon for those in power to wield. It is a shield meant to protect the citizen from that very power. And when that shield is cast aside in the name of a gut feeling, we all become vulnerable to the shadows of bias.